The gauge flashed an urgent red, a glaring warning in my mind. The engine stuttered a final, feeble gasp before shutting down entirely. Just like that, I was gliding in eerie silence, the roaching endlessly ahead, swallowed by the night. Behind me, nothing but darkness. Overhead, the moon cast its cold, indifferent glow. Damn it. My grip tightened, the wheel knuckles turning pale. I pressed the gas pedal out of habit, but the car didn't even sputter. It was lifeless. A corpse on wheels. The highway had been deserted for miles, just skeletal trees and the occasional farmhouse, long abandoned or barely standing. The last person I'd spoken to was my mum, an hour ago, reassuring in that I was making good time on the drive home. Now, as I grabbed my phone off the passenger seat, my stomach sank. No signal. Course, with a frustrated sigh, I let my forehead rest against the steering wheel. I stopped for gas back in that last town. At the thought of choking down stale coffee in some grimy roadside station had been unappealing. My stomach let out a sharp protest. I hadn't eaten since lunch. Then, a flicker of neon in the distance caught my eye. I narrowed my gaze through the windshield, focusing on a swaying sign, its rusted chains creaking in the wind. A squat, unassuming building sat off the road, its faded letters barely legible in the dim glow. Earl's Diner. Open late. Not exactly five-star dining, but it was something. Maybe they'd a phone. Or at least someone who pumped me to a gas station. Or a mechanic who could help when morning came. I pulled my coat from the back seat and sank into the night. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, mingled with something sharper, something metallic, like rust. I forced the thought away and headed toward the diner. Inside, Earl's Diner felt like a relic frozen in time. The black, white checkered floor was worn down to near ruin. Thin boots barely held to by strips of duct tape. A long counter stretched across the room, lined with red-topped stools, the seats cracked from years of use. The walls were stained with age, cluttered with photos of families who looked like they belonged to another era. Another world entirely. Behind the counter, a lone waitress idly wiped a coffee with a look filthier than the cup itself. Her pale blue uniform was cinched at the waist with a white apron, and blonde hair was lazily piled into a beef. Her face was gaunt, cheeks hollow, her lipstick a harsh smear of red. "Help you, hon?" she asked, her voice rough, like she'd just finished chain smoking a pack. "Died a couple miles back," I said, shoving my hands into my pockets. "No phone service out there. You got a landline I can use?" She studied me for a moment before shaking her head. "Phone's busted. Been that way for weeks." I frowned. "Now anywhere I can find a mechanic. Maybe someone I can call the morning." She sucked teeth, eyes flicking toward the kitchen door. "You'll want to talk to Earl. He's in the back." "All right. Mind if I wait here?" "Shoot yourself." I slid onto one of the stools, feeling the cracked vinyl creak beneath me. The air was thick with the scent of burnt greases and something else. Something sickly sweet, like meat left out in the sun too long. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sore cyst in my stomach. A man sat in the farthest booth, half hidden in shadow. His flannel was worn thin, the fabric barely holding together, but skewed his face, still something out and let the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Coffee?" The waitress' voice startled me. "Boo sure." She turned, pouring a stream of liquid from an old steel pot into a chipped ceramic mug. The scent hit me instantly. Bitter and potent, strong enough to strip paint. I took a cautious sip and winced. The kitchen door swung with a creak, and a man stepped out. Stocky, thick arms like tree trunks. His greasy white undershirt touched tight over his round frame. His face was ruddy, but his eyes were sharp, assessing, like a butcher sizing up his next cut. "You're the one with trouble." "Ifruf, the store's me." I stood, trying not to seem uneasy. He wiped his hands on a stained dish towel. "Ain't much of a mechanic. An Ira guy, he don't work nights though. Best you can do is wait till morning." I glanced out the window. The night stretched on, endless and black. The thought of sleeping in my car made my skin crawl, knee moles nearby. Earl chuckled, shaking his head. closest one's a good 20 miles out, and a mulchanti a Treason Road. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Jewess, I'll wait here for a bit. Earl and the waitress exchanged a glance. Quick, unreadable. Rel said, Q sticking around, might as well eat. Best burger in town. It wasn't like I had many choices. My stomach already started twisting itself into knots. Yeah, all right, I'll take a burger. Earl grinned, flashing teeth that were just a little too white. A little too perfect. Maggie'll fix you up. Bewishingly. Gave me a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. I glanced toward the man in the corner booth. He still hadn't moved. Hadn't even turned the page of his newspaper. His stillness was unnatural. Outside, the wind howled, rousing the diners' windows and the frames. My cocky sat in my stomach like a stone. Something was wrong here. I just didn't know what. Not yet. The place had all the trappings of a classic 90s diner, but something about it felt off. Warped, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. An old jukebox in the corner copped to, whirling, where the sound was distorted, warbling like it was playing from underwater. I tried to think of another way out of this. I was stranded, effectively stuck until morning. My car was at least a mile back, not that it would do me much good even if I reached it. I forced myself to ignore the voice and my to leave, but the harder I tried, the louder it got. The jukebox sputtered, skipping mid-song. The music warped, twisting into something uncanny, like reality itself was fraying at the edges. Then a new sound cut through the diner. The sharp sizzle of a grill. The scent of cooking meat filled the air, thick with grease and smoke. But there was something else beneath it. Something acrid. Something wrong. The bixatane burned at the back of my throat, and suddenly my mouth filled with the unmistakable taste of copper. I turned back to the man in the booth. He sat motionless, drenched in shadow. I really saw him. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His lips were cracked, but his eyes, God, his eyes, were the worst part, because they weren't eyes at all. Jutting stark as the space between stars. I blinked hard. I had to be imagining things. The stress, the exhaustion, and reminder. There were you tricks on me. Delusion could be a powerful thing. Snapping out of my trance, I tore my gaze away from the man in the booth, just as Maggie slid a plate in front of me. A chipped white dish, a burger resting in a shallow pool of grease. Too thick. Pink in places where it should have been brown. The scent that rose from it was off, like it had been left out too long, hovering on the edge of rotting, but my stomach was empty, and hunger gnawed at me like a restless, impatient dog. Maggie lingered by the counter, watching. Earl stood by the register crossed, his expression unreadable. The man in the booth still hadn't moved, hadn't turned the page, hadn't done anything at all. The air inside the diner felt thick, pressing like invisible weight. I picked up the burger, hesitated, then took a bite. The taste hit me like a slap. Iron-rich, too chewy, something stringy tangled between my teeth. My stomach twisted as I chewed, my brain working overtime to suppress the alarm bell screaming in my head. That good? Earl's grinning, his eyes sharp, blighting something that looked too much like amusement. I swallowed hard. The meat coated my tongue with an oily residue, my throat tightening as it went down. My pulse thumped against my skull. And then, from the back of the diner, beyond the kitchen doors, a sound, muffled but unmistakable. Reverse screaming. I dropped the burger grease or something worse, slicking my hands. Maggie and Earl weren't looking at me anymore, and were looking at the kitchen door. The bodies were rigid, their expressions unreadable. The man in the booth finally moved. He lowered his newspaper, revealing a gaunt face, his deep-set eyes glistening under the fluorescent lights. His mouth twitched, something that could have been a smile or a sneer. "You should leave," he muttered. My breath, the hell is going on here? Earl took a slow step forward, his hand dipping into his apron pocket. I caught the dull glint of metal, a knife, Maggie stood reached behind the counter, her fingers clenched so tightly around the edge that her knuckles had gone bone white. Then the scream came again, louder this time. Something inside Ian moved, before my mind caught up. I shoved back from the stool so fast it clattered to the ground. I turned, bolted for the door. Behind me, something heavy crashed. It didn't utter. Then came the sound I didn't want to hear. Boots pounding against tile. I lunged for the door, fingers wrapping round the handle, yimping as the cold night air slammed into me. But before I could take a step, a hand clamped around my wrist, like an iron vice. No, no, his breath hot against my ear. You like to leave before dessert. I twisted, jerking back just as something whistled past my face. A knife. It gleamed with a sickly yellow light, buffooing itself into the doorframe with a dull thunk. I didn't hesitate. I pivoted, lunging toward the back of the diner. If there was someone in that kitchen, someone alive, I had to help them. I burst through the swinging doors, my heart slamming against my ribs, and stopped dead. The back wall was lined with metal hooks, and hanging vamp and pale under the unforgiving kitchen lighties. Not cows, not pigs, people. My stomach lurched, a violent twist of nausea and horror. One of them, maybe early 20s, was still moving. His glazed eyes rolled toward me, his lips parting in a soundless. A sharp clatter behind me shattered my paralysis. Footsteps. Earl and Maggie were coming. I grabbed the nearest thing. Rusted. Reaver just as the door slammed open. Earl stood there, grinning like a wolf. The next few seconds were a blur. The cleaver came down. Earl's gun twisted into a howl of pain as he staggered back, blood blooming across his filthy white undershirt. Maggie screamed. I shoved past them, my own breath a ragged mess, my pulse roaring in my ears. I don't know what I saw as I ran through the diner. I didn't care. I had to get out. The man in the booth was still sitting there, still motionless. Just watching, I through the front door and into the freezing night, my legs burning as I ran, and didn't stop until I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. A truck, a real, living person behind the wheel. I stumbled into the road, weaving my arms wider before collapsing to my knees. Halt! Parashiked, my throat raw. Please. The driver, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, looked past me toward the diner. Then slowly he turned to me, his face he muttered. You actually got out. I blinked, dazed, shaking. What? But he didn't answer. Instead, he reached through a passenger door and gestured for me to get in. I hesitated, just for a second. Then, behind me, the diner door let out a slow, creaking wail, and didn't wait to see in who or what was coming for me. I scrambled into the truck, slamming the door shut just as the tires screeched against the asphalt. A wave of relief crashed over me, but deep down I knew had barely escaped.